Where did the obsession of some US presidents with Iranian regime change come from? It may be older than you think. Whether you believe him or not, Donald Trump has said many times he's achieved it, or something like it.
Their first level leaders are dead. Their second level leaders are dead. Some of their third level leaders are dead. I call that regime change.
It wouldn't be the first time that the US has tried. Back in 1953, the CIA led a coup to topple Iran's prime minister, a moment in history that definitely hasn't been forgotten in Iran. Why does the 1953 coup have such a long shadow? And could it still be shaping US and Iranian policy many decades later? From the BBC, I'm Tristan Redman, and this is The Global Story on YouTube.
I'm Scott Anderson. I'm a nonfiction book writer and journalist. I've written a series of nonfiction books, mostly dealing with war and mostly in the Middle East. The British had a concession going back to the early 1900s for the oil in Persia at the time. And ever since they discovered oil in 1907, the British had had a complete monopoly on Persian and Iranian oil. And this became increasingly a flashpoint with Iranian nationalists in the late 1940s, early 1950s, that the Iranians were getting a pittance of the money that was being brought in from the oil industry.
When you say a pittance, what do you mean?
They were supposed to get 20 cents on the dollar of the proceeds of the oil, and they were actually getting more like 8 cents on the dollar. The British were pretty shameless in monopolizing and kind of ripping off the Iranian government. Part of the terms of the contract were the Iranian government was not allowed to look at the ledger books. So this was just a license to steal by the British company that ran it. The British company was also tied to the British government, quasi-private, quasi-government institution. In the early 1950s, a kind of a populist nationalist politician named Mohammad Mossadegh became prime minister of Iran.
When you say a populist nationalist, is there anyone in the modern day pantheon of politicians that you would compare Mossadegh to?
I'd compare him to say Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, a very charismatic populist, very popular among the people, would give firebrand speeches, and largely one of the secrets of his power was to have an external enemy. And that kind of reminds me of Chavez also, that you kind of ride this whether it's anti-Western or, in the case of Mossadegh, anti-British sentiment, this constant refrain of how we're being taken advantage of by this imperial power. And a huge issue at this time was, especially among the nationalists in Iran, was to get back the oil, to break this concession that had been given to the British back in the early 1900s. And Mossadegh he became the chief spokesperson for that. So Mossadegh, he was usurping the Shah's powers and gradually chipping away at what had been the Shah's powers. He nationalized the oil industry. So that put Britain and Iran on a collision course. Britain imposed a blockade on Iran. This continued for about a year and a half. And meanwhile, Mossadegh was not falling, which was, of course, the British hope. So the British devised a plan to overthrow Mossadegh and restore the Shah, who was far more pliant, to his kingly powers, figuring that the Shah would cancel the nationalization, give the oil back to the British. But the British didn't want to have their hands seen in this operation because they were already reviled by the Iranian people. So they looked to the Americans to take care of this operation for them. They first floated this idea to the Truman administration in the summer of 1952. It's like, hey, we have this all set up to overthrow Mossadegh. Will you do this for us? And Truman said, no. Why should we overthrow a democratically elected government for your oil? Truman leaves office in January of 1953. The Eisenhower administration comes in. He has a kind of a rabid anti-communist Secretary of State named John Foster Dulles. The British come back to the Americans right after the inauguration of Eisenhower and repitch the story. And this time the idea of overthrowing Mossadegh has taken on a new shade, which is that waiting in the wings and standing behind Mossadegh are the communists, are the Reds. And
So
they are
this
take...
becomes a classic Cold War dynamic almost.
That's right. That's right. And the Reds, of course, will take Iran into the Soviet sphere, Iran having a very large border with the Soviet Union. So this sufficiently spooks John Foster Dulles and Eisenhower. So they sign on to the idea of carrying out the coup for the behest of the British, and that operation becomes known as Operation Ajax.
Mm-hmm. And what is Operation Ajax? What's the plan?
So the plan is to they have a few operatives inside Tehran in the city. The plan is to basically, the Shah has the power to revoke Mossadegh's prime ministership, and he had tried to do this once before, and it led to massive riots in Tehran. So basically, what the plan is that they are going to have the military on alert and people loyal to the Shah on standby. They're going to inform Mossadegh that he's been dismissed from the prime ministership, and if there's any problems, the people loyal to the Shah will take control of the streets. So that's the basic plan. So the man in charge of Operation Ajax is Kermit Roosevelt, who is a CIA officer, cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, president. So Kermit Roosevelt goes to the Shah and tells him of this plan, that they're going to unseat Mossadegh. The Shah is a famously passive figure. He's a man who has always wanted other people to do his dirty work for him. And he vacillates for months, actually. He goes back and forth of whether he's going to approve or cancel the Operation Ajax. He finally says, yes, we're going forward. And then on the very eve, in about August 12th, 1953, he tries to back out again. The Shah says, no, we're not going to do it. Kermit Roosevelt sneaks into the royal palace. He hides in the footwell of a car and with a blanket over him. He gets into the palace. He confronts the Shah and says, look, it's too late. This coup is going forward either with you or without you. But it's too late to cancel it now. So the Shah kind of agrees, but then the Shah takes his own action. The Shah was a pilot. He loved to fly planes. So that night, he and his second wife get on a small plane that the Shah is piloting, and they fly up to a royal palace, a small royal palace on the Caspian Sea. They get out of Tehran. There's likely to be some unpleasantness, so he wanted to be kind of in a safe spot. What happens is the next day the coup starts. Mossadegh has been tipped off it's coming. He has his own loyalists respond to the Shah's loyalist troops, and there's pitched battles in the streets of Tehran. And this goes on for 2 days. And during those 2 days, the Shah first flies his plane to Iraq, and then flies on to Rome in Italy. So on day 3, what happens is it looks like the coup has failed. Most of the CIA's operatives have fled Tehran. And Kermit Roosevelt locks himself in a CIA safe house and drinking gin and listening to Broadway show tunes. And
that's extraordinary.
I love it.
What's going on there? Tell us more about that.
Apparently he had a passion for Broadway show tunes, but I guess it inspires him because as a kind of a last-ditch effort, he decides he's going to rent a mob. And this is actually something of a tradition in Iran, that you can rent street toughs to attack your rival company or a rival politician. So Kermit Roosevelt hires a group of thugs to masquerade as Mossadegh loyalists and to go through downtown Tehran, smashing windows, roughing people up, and kind of just being hooligans, but hooligans supposedly in support of Mossadegh.
Just to clarify, the role of the renter mob is to essentially paint Mossadegh's supporters in a negative light, and
That's
hoping
right.
that will turn the tide of support against Mossadegh.
That's right. And they're chanting pro-communist slogans. They're smashing windows. They're roughing up passersby.
So it's
they're
a
tearing,
false flag operation, basically.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And it was 11th hour, last ditch idea to try to turn the tide. And against all odds, it
Fueled
worked.
by gin, possibly.
Fueled by gin and Broadway shows. Yeah.
What did the CIA make of this operation? Was this according to the CIA handbook?
The CIA had never really done something quite like this before. It was almost just pure adventurism. It was, it wasn't going to cost much money. It didn't require, the risk level was low. It was kind of let's just see what happens. The backside to this of prior to the Iranian coup, for the previous 6-7 years, the Americans had been trying to foment anti-communist revolts behind the Iron Curtain in the Warsaw Pact countries, and they'd airdropped anti-communist partisans behind enemy lines. Every one of these operations, it was Ukraine, Albania, Romania, Poland. They were all disasters. So by 1953, you'd now had a very static battle line in Europe, the Iron Curtain, and so now I think Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles were thinking, well, okay, this idea comes to us from the British. Let's try it out. Let's see what happens. I don't think it was, very much more complicated than that. Mm-hmm. When it succeeded and the royalists took over, the Shah was having lunch at the Excelsior Hotel in Rome, and he learns that the coup has succeeded. So he kind of comes back 2 days later, kind of a little bit shamefaced, that, who runs away from their own coup, and takes over and sentences, finds Mossadegh guilty of treason, sentences him to internal exile. Mossadegh goes back to his home village and is quarantined there for the next 7 or 8 years until he dies. And now the Shah has absolute powers, and now he's on his way.
What happens to the oil at this point?
I think the Americans kind of pulled a fast one on the Brits a bit. So what happens is, because the Anglo-Iranian oil company is so hated that the Americans, with the Shah's collaboration, obviously, they create this consortium where most of the oil now goes under the control of American oil companies, and a very small part stays with the British. But essentially, the Americans take control of the Iranian oil. And on this level, on the economic level, this is really the beginning of the American alliance in Iran, but not politically. This is the thing that's quite fascinating about the 53 coup, is that because of the Shah's behavior during Operation Ajax, the Americans are actually quite askance of him. Again, who runs away from their own coup? So the American government continues to keep the Shah, if anything, at even more of an arm's length for the next 10, 12 years. They think he's a coward. Obviously, he's very passive. So there's not this huge political investment in the Shah right after Operation Ajax. Yes, you're starting to see the beginning of the economic alliance, but not so much of the political, and that really comes about 10 years later.
Nevertheless, the Shah and the United States are yoked together at this point, right?
Very much so in the eyes of the Iranian people and in the Shah's eyes. Mm-hmm. So he was seen as a creation now of the Americans, even though the Americans didn't want to assume that role and did not assume that role for a long time to come. But of course, this would come back to haunt the Shah during the revolution, because anything he did, even when he instituted reforms or promised change, he was still seen as the American Shah.
Is any part of this story contested?
I'll say in two ways it's quite contested. Mossadegh has been, kind of knighted as the martyr to democracy, and he really wasn't that. He was constantly usurping not only the Shah's authority, but also Parliament's. If things had gone on, there's a very good chance he would have been a dictator. So I think there's been this kind of whitewashing of Mossadegh in history. The second aspect to this is, ironically enough, really the American role in the coup was quite exaggerated, and it was exaggerated by Kermit Roosevelt. Kermit Roosevelt, after the coup... Yeah, I know. Kermit Roosevelt, after the coup, comes back to Washington. He's led into the Oval Office, and he's there with Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles. And it's like this group of boys sitting around in a clubhouse, and they say, "Tell us what happened." And Kermit spins this tale that has him, in this heroic role, and his people being absolutely instrumental in the coup, and they really weren't. But Eisenhower eats this up. He says, "This reads like a dime novel. This is fantastic." And famously, Kermit Roosevelt remembers looking at John Foster Dulles while he's telling the story of Operation Ajax. And John Foster Dulles has a Cheshire cat smile on his face. And already Kermit Roosevelt can tell his brain is whirling with other possibilities. If we did this in Iran, where can we go next?
Well, I have to say, I find this so fascinating, partly because it's so of its time. The story you're telling is of the world emerging from World War II, Britain essentially still believing itself to be a player, very quickly finding out that the United States is the big player in town, entering the operation, stealing all the glory and the oil, returning back to Washington, and backslaps all around. What has the United what's the United States learned from this experience?
Well, it becomes kind of the CIA's new playbook. They've learned, well, it worked so well in Iran, let's do it again. So a year later, they decide they're going to overthrow the democratically elected government of Jacobo Guzman in Guatemala, who wants to do agrarian reform. Most of the land in Guatemala is in the hands of a handful of oligarchic families and the Standard Fruit Company. So he's
similar profile to Mossadegh in Iran.
That's right, very similar, a very similar profile. So the CIA finds this disgruntled ex-Guatemalan colonel to get together a ragtag army of about 40, 50, maybe 60 mercenary soldiers. The idea is they were going to march on Guatemala City. They all bogged down within miles of the border. This assault doesn't go anywhere. But meanwhile, the CIA has a radio transmitter set up, and they're casting these broadcasts into Guatemala saying, the Liberation Army is on the march. And just as what happened in Iran, the loyalist army around Arbenz folds. They collapse. It's another massive bluff, and it works again. Arbenz is overthrown. Guatemala becomes a right-wing dictatorship, very pro-American, very anti-communist, and it stays that way for the next 40 years. So now CIA has achieved two bizarre successes back to back. At very little expenditure, nothing compared to what had been spent in terms of blood and treasure in Eastern Europe. Now this really becomes the playbook. And so over the next 6 years of the Eisenhower administration, the CIA tries to replicate this all throughout the world.
Like where?
Congo, they're in Southeast Asia. They try to step in when the French are flailing in Indochina. They're in the Middle East, in Yemen, and none of those work. But they have the effect of essentially alienating people in every region or sub-region of the world. And the final kind of carry on from this era of CIA adventurism is the Bay of Pigs, and that's all planned under Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles. As Fidel Castro, who's overthrown the dictatorship in Cuba, he becomes more and more of a leftist. There's a CIA plot to overthrow Castro. That becomes the Bay of Pigs under Kennedy, and that's, of course, a fiasco.
That's in 1961, right?
1961. And if you look at that, it was an exact replica of what would happen in Guatemala. You throw 1,200 anti-communist Cubans on a shore on the beach of Cuba, tell them to march on Havana, and that's supposed to overthrow Fidel. And instead, of course, it was a total fiasco.
Okay, so I have to say, we do have a soft spot for the Bay of Pigs story story on the global story, it's one that crops up an unexpected number of times. So I feel like you could play a game of global story bingo, where every time every time the Bay of Pigs comes up, you get a prize. So thank you for raising it again today for those playing global story bingo.
Okay.
So Scott, you've told us about how the 1953 coup in Iran shaped things from the US perspective. Now, last week on The Global Story, we spoke with a woman called Ambassador Wendy Sherman. She was appointed by President Barack Obama to be the US lead negotiator for the Iran nuclear deal. And when we were talking to her, she told us that in her direct negotiations with Iranians, she was aware that the shadow of 1953 was still present for those Iranian negotiators she was talking to. How does anti-American sentiment begin to foment inside Iran after 1953?
Ms. Sherman's absolutely right. So in a way, what happened in 1953 is the Americans took away the role of the British as kind of the great Satan, and it had been the British prior to that, and now it was the Americans. And I think that when you go to, say, the Iranian Revolution of '79, it was '53 that really gave it this sort of the catalyst, because along with it being this religious counter-revolution was a very strong element of kind of anti-colonial rebellion. The Shah was the American Shah. So he was a tool. I mean, again, this is in the eyes of the opposition. He was seen as a tool of the Americans and of the continued domination of Iran by the West. And that was something he could not get out from under with his own people.
What are the practical lessons that Iran learned through that experience in 1953 about how to conduct themselves, particularly in their dealings with the United States?
What I think certainly the Islamic regime has been very adept at was playing that anti-American card to rally the people.
In June 2025.
2025, right. So I was talking to people in the Iranian opposition, and there had been a growing groundswell of dissent against the regime. And what they were saying to me is, if we come out and protest now against the regime, we're tarred as American lackeys and Israeli lackeys. So turns out that in general, people don't like being bombed by foreign countries, and so there is this rallying around the flag effect. And I think that the regime has been very adept at constantly going back to the beginning of American meddling in internal Iranian affairs, going back to 1953. Interestingly, the current regime has never known quite what to do with Mohammad Mossadegh, because he was not he was liberal, he was quasi-socialist. He was not Ayatollah Khomeini in Khomeini's camp. But so they've kind of presented him as this martyr, but not too much of a martyr. He's kind of this. He was kind of the first victim of the American collusion with the Shah.
Scott, I have to ask you, and I didn't realize I was going to be so taken with a character called Kermit Roosevelt. There's a lot of conversation in the modern age about whether the world is shaped by inexorable global forces or by individuals. Is it possible to say that without a gin swilling, show tunes listening intelligence operative called Kermit Roosevelt, we may not be seeing U.S. and Iranian relations such as they are today, and that he changed the course of history?
I think absolutely. I'm very much. I ascribe very much to the latter notion, the kind of the so-called great man theory of history. This idea that just flukish events, the right people or the wrong people at the wrong place at the wrong time can affect history. I think you saw it with Kermit Roosevelt in '53. I sort of think you're seeing with Donald Trump today.
And in the case of Kermit throwing the dice on a wing and a prayer with one last chance to try and make the coup work, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, and all of history changes on that last roll of the dice.
Amazing stuff. Thank you so much, Scott. It's been wonderful to talk this through with you. Thank you for taking the time.
Well, thank you. No, my pleasure. Anytime. Thank you, Tristan.
That was Scott Anderson, author of King of Kings, The Iranian Revolution, a story of hubris, delusion, and catastrophic miscalculation. That's the end of this episode. Thanks for tuning in. The Global Story is also an audio podcast. We're available every weekday. You can find us on bbc.com or wherever you listen. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Cheerio.